There is a unique power in a justice that arrives with a velvet touch and a perfectly steady hand at the end. Witness the smooth, calculated paths of those who finally found their peace after a lifetime of hard struggle. Hit subscribe now and see the price of truth. I came home on a Tuesday evening to find my wife, Margaret, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, staring at nothing. She wasn't sobbing loudly. It was worse than that. She was doing that silent crying that women do when they've been at it for so long they don't have anything left. Just tears running down her face like she'd forgotten they were even there. I set my keys on the counter and said her name. She looked up at me, and for a second I saw something flash across her face. Fear, maybe, or shame, and then it was gone, replaced by that smile she always uses when she doesn't want me to worry. "I'm fine," she said, "just tired." Margaret has been my wife for 38 years. I know every expression she owns. That one wasn't tired. That one was broken. Our son, Daniel, was in the living room. He'd been staying with us for the past 3 weeks, him and his wife, Renee, while their house was supposedly being renovated. Daniel is 51 years old. He works in finance, or used to, and he has always carried himself like a man who knows more than you about everything. He was watching television when I walked in, and barely looked up. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Your mother is crying in the kitchen," I told him. He glanced toward the doorway. "She's been emotional lately. You know how she gets." I didn't say anything to that. I went upstairs, changed out of my work clothes. I still consult part-time for a civil engineering firm out of Columbus, Ohio, 3 days a week, and I sat on the edge of our bed for a moment. Something was wrong in my house. I could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Everything looked normal. Everything smelled normal, but something was sitting in the walls of that house that had no business being there. I should tell you a little about how we got to this point, because it didn't start 3 weeks ago. It started about 8 months earlier, when Daniel called me from what I later learned was a hotel room in Cincinnati, not his office, and told me he'd made some bad investments. "How bad?" I asked. There was a long pause. "About $400,000 bad, Dad." I had to sit down for that one. Margaret and I had worked our entire lives for what we had. I spent 32 years as a structural engineer. Margaret taught elementary school for 27 years and tutored on weekends. We were not rich people, but we were careful people, and careful people over a lifetime can build something solid. Daniel explained that he'd been trying to grow a private investment portfolio on the side. Some of his clients had trusted him with personal funds outside his firm's official channels. It had gone wrong, very wrong. And if he didn't cover the losses within 90 days, he was facing not just financial ruin, but potential legal consequences. I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner. "I thought I could fix it," he said. His wife, Renee, got on the phone then. She was crying. She told me they might lose the house. She told me their 8-year-old son, Cooper, my grandson, was already asking questions because he could tell something was wrong. That got to me. I won't pretend it didn't. Cooper is a quiet, serious little boy who builds things out of Lego for hours without saying a word. He reminds me of myself at that age. The thought of him sitting in the middle of his parents' disaster, confused and scared, hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. Margaret and I talked about it for 3 nights before we agreed to help. We would loan Daniel $200,000 from our retirement savings. Not give loan, with paperwork, with a repayment schedule. Margaret was the one who insisted on the paperwork. She'd always been more clear-eyed about Daniel than I was. I loved my son completely, but I think I had always loved him a little blindly. We hired a family attorney, a woman named Patricia, who drew up a formal promissory note. Daniel signed it without complaint. Renee thanked us like we'd pulled her out of a burning building, and for a while things seemed to stabilize. Then, 6 months later, Daniel called again. He needed more. This time he needed another $150,000. There were additional complications, he said. Legal fees. A settlement with one of the clients. Margaret was in the room when he called, and I watched her face go carefully neutral in the way she does when she is controlling a strong emotion. I told Daniel we needed time to think. After we hung up, Margaret said quietly, "Raymond, if we give him more money, we will have nothing left." I knew she was right. I also knew Daniel, And I knew that when he was in trouble, he had a way of making you feel like the entire catastrophe was somehow your fault for not saving him fast enough. I recognized that pattern. I just hadn't wanted to name it until my wife named it for me. We told Daniel we couldn't give him more. He was disappointed. Renee was cold on the phone for 2 weeks afterward, but things settled down, or seemed to. Then Daniel asked if he and Renee could stay with us for a month while their kitchen was being renovated. He was cheerful when he asked. Normal. I thought we were past the worst of it. They moved in on a Thursday with Cooper and 3 suitcases and a slow cooker Renee said she couldn't live without. Cooper set up his Lego set in the guest room and was happy. For the first few days, everything was fine. Then it started. It was small things at first. Margaret would tell me that Renee had said something dismissive to her in the kitchen, a comment about how she'd loaded the dishwasher, a remark about her cooking that wasn't quite a criticism, but wasn't quite not one either. Margaret brushed it off. She is a gracious woman who grew up in a house where you didn't make a fuss. Then Daniel started talking about our finances. Casually, over dinner, he'd bring up the market, interest rates, what our house might be worth now. He asked once, out of nowhere, whether we'd updated our will recently. I said it was up to date and changed the subject. One night I came home late from Columbus and heard voices in the kitchen. I stopped in the hallway. Daniel and Renee were talking in low, quick tones. I caught pieces of it. Something about her name on the account. Something about before he changes anything. Then Renee said, clearly enough that I heard every word, "She won't push back. She never does." I went back to the front door, opened it, and closed it louder the second time. By the time I got to the kitchen, they were both standing at the counter, looking ordinary. That was the night I went to the garage, pulled out the box where I keep the equipment for our home security system, and I installed 3 cameras I'd bought 3 years ago and never used. One in the living room, pointed at the couch in the front hallway. One in the kitchen, mounted high in the corner near the window. One in the upstairs hallway outside our bedroom door. I didn't tell Margaret. I told myself I was being cautious. I told myself it was probably nothing. It was not nothing. I watched the first full day of footage 2 days later, on a Saturday morning when Daniel and Renee had taken Cooper to the park. What I saw in those recordings changed the way I understood everything that had happened over the past 8 months. The kitchen camera showed Renee, at 10:17 in the morning, going through the drawer where Margaret keeps important documents, insurance cards, the deed to our car, various household papers. She was methodical about it. She went through every folder. She photographed several pages with her phone. Then she put everything back, exactly as it had been, and made herself a cup of tea. That same day, at 2:45 in the afternoon, while I was at work, the living room camera showed Daniel sitting on the couch with his own laptop open, on the phone with someone. He was speaking quietly. I had to turn the volume all the way up to hear him on the recording. He said, "She's going to be easier to manage than I thought. She's lonely when he's not home." Then a pause. Then, "No, she doesn't suspect anything. She thinks Renee's being helpful." I sat with that for a long time. I went back through 3 days of footage. What I found in those recordings was a careful, patient operation. Renee was warm and attentive to Margaret when I was home. When I wasn't home, something shifted. The warmth became efficiency. She asked Margaret about her medications, oh so casually, just making sure she had what she needed. She'd taken note of every prescription bottle in the bathroom cabinet. I know because she photographed those too. She encouraged Margaret to rest more, told her she looked pale, suggested, gently and repeatedly, that Margaret might benefit from seeing a specialist, that she'd been more forgetful lately, that maybe some of the decisions around the house were getting to be too much for her. She was building a case, slowly, quietly. She was constructing a version of my wife as a woman who was declining, who needed help, managing her affairs, who perhaps should not be the sole signatory on certain accounts. And Daniel, my son, my only child, was the architect of the whole plan. There was one recording I almost couldn't finish watching. It was from Wednesday afternoon. Margaret was in the kitchen making tea. Renee came in and stood too close to her at the counter, and I watched my wife instinctively move half a step away. Renee said something I couldn't fully hear, but I could read Margaret's body language. She went still, the way a person goes still when they're trying not to show that something just frightened them. When I came home that evening and found her crying over a cold cup of coffee, I understood for the first time what had been happening to my wife inside her own home. I did not confront Daniel that night. I did not confront Renee. I went upstairs and I thought carefully for a long time, and then I called Patricia, our family attorney, at 8 in the morning the next day and asked her to meet me for coffee. Patricia listened to everything I said without interrupting. She is 63 years old and has practiced family law for over 30 years, and there is very little that surprises her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Raymond, the most important thing you can do right now is not let them know you know." I asked her what my options were. She walked me through them. We needed to document everything. The footage I had was valuable, but I needed more specificity, dates, times, clear evidence of financial intent, not just suspicious behavior. She told me to go through our accounts and make sure nothing had been accessed or altered without my knowledge. She also suggested I speak with our financial advisor immediately. I did all of those things. That same week, quietly, while Daniel was at what he said was a meeting in Cleveland, I met with our financial advisor, a man named George who's been managing what's left of our retirement accounts for 15 years. I showed him what I knew. George was not entirely surprised. "Your son called me 2 weeks ago," he said. "He identified himself as calling on your behalf. He asked some questions about the structure of your accounts, specifically about joint access and beneficiary designations." I asked George if he'd given him any information. "I told him I'd need written authorization from both you and Margaret before discussing anything," George said. "He said he'd follow up. He never did." I asked George to note in my file that no changes were to be made to any account without my physical presence and a second form of identification. He did it while I sat there. I also, that week, called a different attorney, one I found independently, not through any contact Daniel might know, and I had my will reviewed. There were no unauthorized changes, but I had it updated and sealed with a notation in the file that any future changes required a secondary verification process. I was not angry yet, or rather, I was angry in the cold, clear way that doesn't feel like anger when you're in the middle of it. It feels like precision. Every step I took that week felt very precise. On Friday evening, I told Margaret I'd like to talk to her. We went into the backyard and sat on the old bench we put in 20 years ago when we first planted the garden. Cooper was inside watching a movie. Daniel and Renee were in the kitchen. I told Margaret everything. I showed her the recordings on my laptop. I watched her face as she watched the footage of Renee going through our documents. I watched her face as she heard our son on the phone talking about managing her. Margaret did not cry. She looked at the screen for a long time after I stopped the video. Then she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, "I knew something was wrong. I didn't want to believe it." I took her hand. I told her what Patricia had advised, what George had done, what I'd arranged with the new attorney. I told her I needed her help with one more thing. She asked what? I said, "I need a few more days. I need them to try one more time." Margaret understood. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "You know this is going to be the hardest thing we've ever done." I told her I knew. I told her we had done hard things before. She squeezed my hand and said, "Don't let them see your face change." The following week, I was different. I came home from Columbus on Monday and was warm, relaxed, easy. I complimented Renee on dinner. I asked Daniel about his situation with a tone of genuine concern. He talked for 40 minutes about how things were slowly stabilizing, how grateful they were for our support, how they just needed a little more time to get back on their feet. On Wednesday, Renee brought up, very gently, over breakfast, that she'd been doing some research. She thought Margaret might benefit from speaking with a specialist at Ohio State. She'd already looked into it, she said. She had a name. She thought it might give everyone peace of mind. Margaret looked at me across the table. A small look. I nodded slightly. Margaret told Renee that she appreciated it, that it was so thoughtful, that maybe they could look into it together. I watched Renee's face. She almost couldn't contain the satisfaction. That same evening, Daniel found a quiet moment and sat down with me in the study. He said he'd been thinking. He said he felt terrible about the burden they'd put on us. He said he wondered, and he said it carefully. in the way he'd always been careful when he was about to ask for something large, whether it might make sense to simplify things while he and Renee were here, maybe consolidate some accounts, make it easier for them to help us manage things. I said that sounded interesting. I said I'd think about it. He smiled, and there was something behind that smile I'd never seen before, or maybe never let myself see. Relief. Not the relief of a man who loves his parents. The relief of a man who has been waiting for a door to open. I said good night and went upstairs and texted Patricia. On Friday morning, while Daniel was on a call in the guest room and Cooper was at school, Patricia came to our house. Renee was in the kitchen. Margaret was in the living room. I brought Patricia in through the side door into the study. We sat together, me, Margaret, and Patricia, for 45 minutes. Patricia had prepared several documents, a formal cease and desist on any further inquiry into our financial accounts, to be delivered through proper channels to Daniel's attorney. A letter documenting, with dated references to the security footage, the pattern of behavior we'd observed over the previous 3 weeks. And a third document that Patricia had quietly obtained on our behalf, the results of a background check on Daniel's current financial situation that revealed, among other things, that the legal trouble he'd described to us 8 months ago was significantly more serious than he'd let on, and that there was an active civil suit against him from one of his former clients. We had not known about the lawsuit. Margaret read the background report without a word. When she finished, she folded it neatly and set it on the desk and said, "How long has he been lying to us?" Patricia said gently, "At least 3 years." I had already decided what I was going to say when the time came. I'd thought about it every night that week. I had thought about Daniel at 8 years old, sitting on my shoulders at a 4th of July parade, gripping my hair with both fists so he wouldn't fall. I had thought about Margaret driving him to swim practice at 5:30 in the morning for 4 years without complaint. I had thought about all of it, and I had let myself feel it, and then I had decided what kind of man I was going to be on the other side of it. I asked Patricia to stay. I went to the kitchen, where Renee was standing at the counter, scrolling on her phone. I asked her to come into the study. I went to the guest room and knocked on the door, and told Daniel I needed him downstairs. They both came in looking unconcerned. Renee sat in the chair by the window. Daniel stood near the door. I said, "I want to talk to you both about a few things." I put the laptop on the desk and turned it toward them. I played the footage of Renee going through our documents. Then I played the audio of Daniel on the phone. The room was very quiet. Renee said, in a voice that was trying to be calm, "That's taken out of context." Daniel said nothing. He was looking at the screen, and I watched something collapse behind his eyes. He'd been running a version of this conversation in his head for months, I think. He just hadn't expected the script to go this way. I told them what Patricia had done with our accounts and our attorney. I told them about the background check. I told them about the civil suit. I slid the documentation across the desk. Daniel looked at it. Then he looked at me, and he said, "Dad, I can explain." "I know you can," I said. "You've always been very good at explaining." Margaret spoke from the couch, in the same quiet voice she'd used on that Friday evening in the garden. She said, "I need you to hear me when I say this, Daniel. You are my son. You will always be my son. But what you did in this house, what you asked Renee to do to me, was a cruelty I didn't expect from you." He looked at her. For a moment I thought I saw something real cross his face. She continued, "You were trying to make people believe your own mother was losing her mind so you could get to our money. You were trying to take away my voice and my standing in my own home. Do you understand what that means to me? Do you understand what it means to do that to a woman?" Renee started to say something. Patricia raised a hand just slightly, and Renee stopped. Daniel sat down heavily in the chair near the door. He put his hands over his face. I told them they had until Sunday to leave the house. I told them Cooper was welcome to visit us whenever he wanted, as often as he wanted, because Cooper had done nothing wrong, and I loved him, and that was not going to change. I told Daniel that the promissory note from the first loan was still in effect, and I expected him to honor it. I told him that if any further attempt was made to access our accounts or our legal documents, Patricia would be filing a formal complaint. I told him there was one more thing. I handed him a letter, sealed, addressed to the managing director of the civil engineering firm in Columbus, where I still had professional connections. The letter was not from me, it was from George, our financial advisor, and it outlined what we knew about Daniel's conduct in the pending lawsuit. I was not going to send it, not unless I had to. But Daniel needed to know it existed. He looked at the envelope for a long time. I said, "I'm giving you a chance to handle your situation honestly. Don't make me regret it." He and Renee left on Saturday, one day early. They packed quietly. Cooper hugged me around the waist when they were loading the car and didn't say anything, just held on for a moment, and I held on too. After their car turned the corner at the end of our street, Margaret came and stood beside me at the front door. We stood there for a while without talking. Then she said, "He's going to have to figure it out on his own." I said, "I know." She said, "That's going to be hard for you." I said, "Yes." She took my arm, and we went inside, and I made us coffee, and we sat in the kitchen for a long time, in the kind of quiet that belongs to two people who have been through something together and come out the other side, still holding each other's hand. Daniel did not contact us for 6 weeks. When he did, it was a short email. He said he was getting help, a financial counselor, and what I understood to be some form of professional accountability review within his industry. He did not apologize directly. But the email was not the email of a man running a scheme. It was the email of a man who had been stopped. I wrote back 2 sentences. I told him I was glad he was getting help. I told him the door was open if he wanted to walk through it honestly. Renee has not been in contact. I don't know what the future holds for their marriage. That is their business. Cooper calls every Sunday. He talks about school, about his Lego sets, about a book series he's been reading, about a boy who discovers he can talk to animals. He doesn't ask about what happened. Children know more than we give them credit for, but they also know how to set things aside when they need to. He is a resilient, perceptive little boy, and I believe he is going to be all right. Margaret is better. She started a watercolor class on Thursday mornings, something she'd wanted to do for years. There are paintings going up on the walls of our house, the backyard in early spring, a streetlight in the rain, a portrait of Cooper she painted from a photograph. Our house feels like our house again. I am 64 years old. I worked for 32 years, and I was careful, and I built something with the woman I love, and I am not ashamed to say that when someone tried to take her dignity along with it, I made sure they didn't. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because I know I'm not the only person who has sat at a kitchen table and seen something behind a family member's eyes and not wanted to name it. I know there are people watching this who have felt that particular loneliness of suspecting someone you love and having no way to be certain and no one to tell. Here is what I would tell you, as someone who has been on the other side of it. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to use every legal, careful, methodical tool available to you. You are allowed to stop being the person who absorbs the damage in silence. And if you have a Margaret sitting beside you, someone who, when everything comes apart, says don't let them see your face change, you hold on to her. You hold on to her the way my grandson held on to me at the front door on the last morning, like there was something in that grip worth keeping. Because there is. There always is.